Do not mistake silence for weakness, because sometimes silence is the final form of authority. The words were never spoken aloud in that moment, but they were reflected in every movement taking place on a busy afternoon street in downtown Chicago where the wind carried noise, footsteps, and distant traffic without pause. On the corner of a concrete sidewalk near a public courthouse, 3 uniformed police officers had already established control over the scene, their presence forming a tight perimeter that discouraged interference from the growing crowd. Officer Ryan Mitchell stood closest to the subject, his posture rigid, his focus locked on procedure rather than interpretation, while Officer Brandon Cole maintained visual control of the surrounding pedestrians, and Officer Ethan Brooks monitored radio communication with brief, clipped responses that suggested urgency without clarity. In the center of their formation was a woman, her wrists secured to a metal fence that bordered the sidewalk, positioned in a way that forced her to remain standing despite the tension of the situation. She was a black woman dressed in a simple dark coat, her appearance unremarkable to the casual observer, yet her composure was strikingly different from what the situation might have suggested. Her head remained lifted, her expression controlled, not pleading, not resisting, but observing everything with a quiet awareness that did not match the assumptions being made about her identity. Around them, pedestrians slowed, some stopping entirely, several lifting their phones to record, their expressions shifting between confusion and concern as the scene unfolded without clear explanation. Officer Mitchell spoke in a firm tone, repeating that she was being detained under suspicion of federal interference, though the exact details were not publicly stated, creating an informational gap that only increased tension rather than resolving it. The woman did not interrupt, did not argue, did not attempt to physically resist, but her silence was not passive, it was attentive, as if she was documenting every procedural step internally. Officer Cole glanced briefly at her face, then returned his attention to the crowd, as though avoiding interpretation that might complicate the situation. A few bystanders whispered that something felt inconsistent about the level of control being applied, but no one stepped forward. The afternoon light reflected off nearby glass buildings, casting fragmented reflections across the metal fence, the uniforms, and the still figure at the center of the scene. Every element appeared ordinary in isolation, yet together it created an atmosphere that felt increasingly unstable. And within that instability, the woman remained the only constant presence, not reacting to the authority surrounding her in the way it expected, but instead watching, waiting, and remaining fully aware of everything that was being decided without her. The scene continued without interruption, yet the sense of control that the officers had established was beginning to feel less stable as more details remained unspoken than clarified. The woman remained secured to the fence in the same position, her posture unchanged, but her attention had subtly shifted toward the small patterns of behavior around her, as if she was tracking inconsistencies rather than reacting emotionally to the situation itself. Officer Ryan Mitchell adjusted his stance slightly, maintaining a professional distance while repeating procedural confirmation into his radio, though his tone suggested increasing pressure from unseen command channels. Officer Brandon Cole stepped half a pace to the side, scanning the growing crowd of civilians who now formed a loose semicircle at a cautious distance, many holding phones at chest level, recording without speaking. Officer Ethan Brooks briefly checked a digital device attached to his uniform, then paused longer than necessary, as if verifying something that did not immediately align with the assumption that had led to the detention. The woman finally spoke for the first time, her voice calm and even, not raised, not emotional, but precise in a way that drew attention despite its softness. "You are acting on an assumption that has not been verified," she said simply. Officer Mitchell responded without turning fully toward her, stating that verification was in process and that compliance was required until confirmation was complete. The phrasing was procedural, yet the delay in confirmation created a subtle tension that the surrounding crowd began to notice more clearly. A man near the back of the gathering raised his phone higher, whispering that something about the situation did not align with typical enforcement protocol, while another person questioned why a routine arrest appeared to involve this level of public containment. The woman did not struggle against the restraint, but her eyes moved methodically from officer to officer, then briefly toward the courthouse building behind them, as if mentally mapping jurisdictional boundaries rather than reacting to physical limitation. Officer Cole noticed her gaze and frowned slightly, though he said nothing. The afternoon light shifted as clouds passed overhead, briefly dimming the reflection on the metal fence and softening the harsh contrast between uniforms, concrete, and glass. For a moment, the entire scene felt suspended in a state of unresolved definition, where authority was present but not yet fully validated by context. Officer Brooks finally spoke into his radio again, this time more slowly, repeating identification details with careful emphasis, suggesting that the system on the other end was taking longer than expected to respond. The woman remained still, her expression unchanged, but her stillness now carried a different weight, less like compliance and more like patience under observation. And as the crowd continued to grow and the uncertainty deepened, the balance between perceived authority and unconfirmed identity began to shift in a way that none of the officers had yet acknowledged directly. The tension at the courthouse perimeter continued to evolve in subtle but unmistakable ways, as the delay in verification created a widening gap between what the officers believed they were controlling and what was actually being confirmed through official channels. The woman remained secure to the fence in the same position, her posture unchanged, yet her focus had shifted into a deeper form of observation, as if she was no longer merely a subject within the situation but also an analyst of it. Officer Ryan Mitchell spoke less frequently now, his earlier procedural certainty replaced with shorter updates into his radio, each response met with longer pauses from the other end. Officer Brandon Cole maintained visual control of the crowd, but his attention was increasingly divided between the growing number of civilians and the subtle inconsistencies emerging in the situation's structure. Officer Ethan Brooks checked his device again, then held it slightly longer in his hand, reading information that appeared to require more cognitive adjustment than anticipated. The crowd had grown larger, now extending further along the sidewalk, with more individuals raising phones to capture the scene, their expressions shifting from curiosity to concern, and in some cases, quiet skepticism. The woman finally adjusted her gaze upward toward the courthouse entrance, not moving her body against the restraint, but clearly aligning her attention with something beyond the immediate enforcement perimeter. That small shift was noticed by Officer Cole, who frowned slightly but said nothing, as if unsure whether acknowledging it would alter the situation's perceived control. Officer Mitchell stepped a fraction closer, maintaining professional distance while speaking in a lower tone, reminding her that cooperation would expedite verification. The woman responded calmly without changing her posture, stating that verification was not a matter of speed but of accuracy, and that both were often confused in field assumptions. Her tone remained steady, without accusation, yet the statement introduced a conceptual pressure into the interaction that did not require volume to be felt. A few members of the crowd exchanged uncertain glances, one person quietly noting that the level of restraint being used appeared disproportionate to the lack of visible evidence. Officer Brooks finally received a longer transmission on his device and paused, reading the information twice before adjusting his stance slightly. His expression changed subtly, not into alarm, but into recognition that something in the initial classification might not fully align with incoming data. Officer Mitchell noticed the shift and asked for confirmation, but Brooks hesitated before responding, choosing carefully measured words that suggested the situation required further review rather than immediate action. The woman remained silent again, her eyes moving once more between the officers and the courthouse structure, as if she was already aware of the direction the verification process was beginning to take. The atmosphere around the fence felt increasingly unstable, not through physical escalation, but through the gradual erosion of certainty. And as the officers continued to wait for final confirmation, the difference between perceived authority and verified identity began to narrow toward an outcome that had not yet been openly acknowledged. The waiting period outside the courthouse had now reached a point where silence itself felt procedural, as if everyone present had unconsciously agreed to pause reality until an official answer arrived. The woman remained secure to the fence, her posture unchanged, yet her attention had become even more focused, not on the officers directly, but on the chain of communication unfolding between authority levels that were no longer fully visible to the crowd. Officer Ryan Mitchell stood slightly forward of his original position, his earlier confidence replaced with a more restrained stance, as he continued to receive delayed responses through his radio channel. Officer Brandon Cole now divided his attention more evenly between the crowd and the incoming updates, his body language suggesting a subtle shift from enforcement certainty to situational reassessment. Officer Ethan Brooks held his device at chest level, reading an extended confirmation sequence that appeared to be expanding beyond standard field verification protocol. The crowd had grown quieter, not because interest had faded, but because uncertainty had replaced assumption. More phones were now visibly recording, and several individuals had stepped closer within the permitted distance, their expressions no longer purely observational but increasingly analytical. The woman finally shifted her gaze forward again. Aligning directly with Officer Mitchell, not with aggression or resistance, but with calm awareness that suggested she was fully tracking the progression of verification in real time. Mitchell noticed this and briefly tightened his grip on procedural documentation, though he did not speak immediately. A long pause followed, during which only radio static and distant city noise filled the space between all participants. Then Officer Brooks spoke, his voice lower and more deliberate than before, stating that the identification profile associated with the detained individual was being cross-referenced with federal judiciary records, and that the process required immediate supervisory confirmation. The phrasing altered the emotional temperature of the scene without any physical change, as the implication of federal-level review began to settle into the awareness of those closest to the fence. Officer Cole turned his head slightly toward Mitchell, exchanging a brief look that carried recognition of procedural escalation beyond their initial classification. The woman remained still, but her expression shifted only subtly, not into satisfaction or reaction, but into confirmation that the system was now aligning with what she had expected from the beginning. A few members of the crowd began to lower their phones slightly, as if recognizing that the nature of the event was no longer simple public enforcement but something requiring formal institutional clarity. Officer Mitchell finally spoke into the radio in a slower cadence, requesting direct supervisory authorization at the highest available level, while maintaining current containment protocol. The atmosphere tightened not through action, but through anticipation, as every participant understood that the next response would determine the direction of everything that followed. And in that suspended moment, the difference between assumption and verified authority was no longer theoretical, but on the verge of being formally resolved. The atmosphere outside the courthouse had now shifted into a state of controlled anticipation, where every second felt heavier because it was no longer about interpretation but about confirmation that was actively in progress. The woman remained secured to the fence, her posture unchanged, yet there was a noticeable refinement in her focus, as if she was now fully aware that the system she had referenced earlier was beginning to respond in real time. Officer Ryan Mitchell stood in a more rigid posture than before, his communication with dispatch becoming slower and more deliberate, each exchange now requiring acknowledgment from multiple levels of authority beyond the initial field unit. Officer Brandon Cole had repositioned slightly to maintain visual coverage of both the crowd and the detained subject, but his body language now suggested caution rather than control, as if the framework of certainty he had been operating under was no longer fully reliable. Officer Ethan Brooks kept his attention fixed on his device, reading through a sequence of verification updates that extended beyond local jurisdictional databases and into federal judicial confirmation channels. The crowd had grown quieter still, with fewer movements and more fixed attention, as if the presence of uncertainty had reduced the instinct to speak. Several phones remained raised, but even those holding them appeared more focused on observation than reaction. The woman finally lowered her gaze briefly, then returned it forward, not toward the officers directly, but toward the space beyond them where institutional confirmation would originate. That subtle shift created a noticeable pause in Officer Mitchell's movements, though he maintained procedural stance without acknowledging the change verbally. A moment later, Officer Brooks received a direct transmission that caused him to pause for longer than before, his eye scanning the message twice before his posture adjusted slightly. He did not speak immediately, but when he did, his tone carried a clear change in structure, stating that federal judiciary authentication was actively matching the identity profile of the detained individual with high-priority classification. The phrasing was no longer speculative, it was procedural confirmation in progress. Officer Mitchell turned his head slightly toward Brooks, asking for immediate clarification, and Brooks responded that supervisory federal confirmation units were now engaged in direct verification with courthouse authority records. The shift in language caused a subtle but unmistakable change in the environment, as the implication of oversight from a higher institutional level became fully present within the scene. The woman remained still, her expression unchanged, but her stillness now carried a different meaning, less like endurance and more like established expectation. A few members of the crowd lowered their phones further, their expression shifting from curiosity to recognition that they were witnessing a procedural escalation rather than an ordinary enforcement interaction. Officer Cole adjusted his stance again, now positioned slightly behind Mitchell, as if recalibrating his role within a structure that was no longer fully defined by their initial assumptions. The radio channel crackled once more with an incoming confirmation request from a higher authority level, and all movement near the fence slowed almost imperceptibly. And in that narrowing space between field enforcement and federal validation, the situation reached a point where resolution was no longer a matter of interpretation, but of imminent institutional acknowledgment. The final stage of the situation outside the courthouse unfolded with a level of quiet precision that contrasted sharply with the tension that had built over the previous minutes, as if the entire scene had transitioned from uncertainty into formal institutional confirmation. The woman remained secured to the fence, her posture unchanged, yet her attention was now fully aligned with the incoming resolution that had been developing through layered channels of verification. Officer Ryan Mitchell stood completely still for a moment after receiving the latest transmission, his previous procedural confidence replaced by a restrained posture that suggested recognition of a shift in authority beyond his operational level. Officer Brandon Cole lowered his gaze slightly, adjusting his position as the implication of federal confirmation became undeniable, while Officer Ethan Brooks held his device steady, reading the final authentication line that confirmed identity match at the highest judicial clearance level. The surrounding crowd had grown quieter than at any previous point, with most movement reduced to still observation, phones still raised but no longer shifting angles, as if the audience itself understood that the moment of uncertainty had reached its conclusion. A brief pause followed, during which even the ambient sound of the street felt distant, as if the focus of the entire environment had narrowed to a single point of resolution. Then Officer Brooks spoke in a controlled tone, confirming that federal judiciary verification had been completed and that the detained individual's identity matched an active federal judicial authority record with full jurisdictional clearance. The phrasing carried finality, and in that instant, the structure of authority within the scene changed completely. Officer Mitchell straightened slightly, stepping back from his earlier position, while Officer Cole adjusted his stance to a more neutral posture, no longer maintaining the same level of enforcement presence. The woman, still calm and composed, finally shifted her gaze forward, not with reaction, but with acknowledgment that the process had reached its expected conclusion. Within moments, additional confirmation arrived through official channels, and the instructions from higher authority were delivered clearly, directing immediate release of restraints and full cessation of enforcement protocol at the scene. The officers complied without hesitation, their movements now procedural in a different sense, reflecting not control but correction. The metal restraint was removed carefully, and the woman's position at the fence was released without resistance or urgency. She did not step forward immediately, instead remaining still for a brief moment, allowing the transition of authority to fully settle across the environment. The crowd remained silent, many lowering their phones entirely, as the realization spread that the individual they had witnessed detained was not a suspect but a federal judicial authority operating under verified jurisdiction. Officer Mitchell took a small step back, his expression controlled but visibly adjusted to the updated reality of the situation, while Officer Brooks closed his device and returned to standard stance protocol. The woman finally turned slightly toward the courthouse, then forward again, her expression composed and steady, reflecting neither confrontation nor emotion, but completion of procedure. And as the institutional confirmation settled fully across the scene, the entire environment shifted from perceived enforcement to recognized authority, leaving behind a silence that now carried the weight of formal legal resolution. The courthouse perimeter had now fully transitioned from a scene of confusion into a scene of formal acknowledgment, where every movement carried the weight of corrected interpretation rather than uncertain enforcement. The woman stood free from the fence, her posture unchanged, yet her presence now defined the space in an entirely different way, as if the environment itself had adjusted its understanding of her identity. Officer Ryan Mitchell remained still for several seconds after the release of restraints, his attention fixed forward, processing the shift from active detention to procedural correction. Officer Brandon Cole had stepped slightly back from his earlier position, his stance no longer oriented toward control but toward observation of protocol completion, while Officer Ethan Brooks reviewed the final confirmation on his device one last time before lowering it completely. The crowd, which had previously formed a tense semicircle of anticipation, now stood in quieter stillness, many lowering their phones fully, as the realization of the situation's resolution settled across the scene. The woman finally took a slow step forward, not toward the officers, but toward the open space in front of her, as if reclaiming the neutrality of the environment rather than reacting to it. Officer Mitchell made a small movement consistent with formal closure protocol, acknowledging that the detention status had been fully rescinded, while Officer Cole adjusted his position to restore standard field spacing. The woman's expression remained composed, her gaze steady, now directed toward the courthouse entrance with a clarity that suggested final alignment with institutional process rather than external perception. A brief exchange occurred over the radio channels confirming that federal judiciary authorization had been fully verified and logged, and that all field actions were to be recorded as procedural misclassification corrected in real time. The tone of communication shifted entirely from uncertainty to administrative closure, reinforcing that the situation was no longer active enforcement but resolved identification. The woman did not address the officers directly, nor did she acknowledge the crowd, but instead stood in a quiet pause that felt deliberate, as if allowing the transition of understanding to settle completely before any further action. Around her, the atmosphere continued to decompress, with civilians slowly dispersing their attention, some lowering devices completely, others stepping back to resume normal movement along the sidewalk. Officer Mitchell gave a final nod to the coordination channel, then turned slightly as if preparing to disengage from the scene, while Officer Brooks closed out the verification sequence on his device and returned it to standard position. The courthouse steps in the background remained unchanged, yet their symbolic meaning had shifted entirely within the perception of those present, now representing institutional validation rather than procedural uncertainty. The woman finally turned slightly away from the fence line area, her movement calm and unhurried, indicating that the moment of resolution had passed and no further explanation was required. And as the officers completed their procedural reset and the crowd began to fully disperse, the scene settled into a quiet conclusion defined not by confrontation, but by the complete reversal of assumed authority through verified identity. The final stage of the courthouse incident unfolded in a way that felt less like an ending and more like a formal recalibration of institutional understanding, where every participant was now fully aware that the situation had already moved beyond initial misclassification and into documented correction. The woman stood a short distance from the fence line where she had been restrained earlier, her posture unchanged in its calm composure, yet her presence now carried a distinctly different weight in the environment, as if the space itself had adjusted its recognition of her identity. Officer Ryan Mitchell remained in place for several seconds longer than necessary, his attention no longer focused on enforcement but on procedural closure confirmation being transmitted through official channels. Officer Brandon Cole had shifted into a neutral stance, his earlier defensive positioning fully relaxed, now aligned with standard post-incident protocol rather than active control. Officer Ethan Brooks completed the final system log entry on his device, confirming that federal judiciary verification had been fully authenticated and that all field actions were to be reclassified as procedural error correction rather than active enforcement engagement. The surrounding crowd, which had previously maintained a dense semicircle of attention, now began to disperse slowly, many lowering their recording devices entirely, while others remained momentarily still as if processing the reversal of what they had witnessed. The woman turned her head slightly toward the courthouse entrance, her gaze steady and composed, not acknowledging the officers or the crowd directly, but instead orienting herself toward the institutional structure that had ultimately confirmed her identity. Officer Mitchell made a final procedural acknowledgment over the radio channel, confirming full release status and closure of the field incident, while Officer Cole adjusted his position one final time before stepping back into standard patrol spacing. The atmosphere, which had once been defined by uncertainty and contested interpretation, now reflected administrative finality, where all prior assumptions had been formally corrected through verified authority confirmation. The woman took a slow step forward, not hurried, not reactive, but deliberate, as if concluding her presence within the space was now a matter of completion rather than response. Her expression remained unchanged, calm and controlled, reflecting neither satisfaction nor confrontation, but a quiet recognition of resolution. Behind her, the courthouse steps remained unchanged, yet their meaning had fully transitioned in the perception of those present from a site of confusion to a symbol of validated authority. Officer Brooks secured his device and prepared to leave the immediate perimeter, while Officer Mitchell remained still for a final moment before turning slightly away from the scene, signaling procedural disengagement. The crowd continued to thin, conversations reduced to quiet exchanges of uncertainty and reconsideration, as the significance of what had occurred settled into collective awareness. And as the last formal confirmations were logged into the system and field presence began to dissolve, the scene reached its final state of closure, defined not by confrontation or escalation, but by the complete restoration of institutional clarity through verified judicial identity. The courthouse exterior had now fully transitioned into a state of procedural calm, where the final traces of confusion had been replaced by formal recognition and quiet dispersal. The woman stood a few steps away from the original detention point, her posture unchanged, her expression composed, and her attention no longer directed toward the officers or the crowd, but toward the broader institutional environment that had confirmed her identity without ambiguity. Officer Ryan Mitchell remained near the edge of the sidewalk for several seconds after the official closure, his stance relaxed but still structured, as if completing the final internal step of an operation that had ended differently than initially assumed. Officer Brandon Cole had already shifted into disengagement posture, scanning the area one final time before fully releasing situational focus. Officer Ethan Brooks stood with his device lowered, the verification sequence now fully logged and archived, his attention no longer required for active confirmation. The crowd had almost completely dispersed, leaving only a few lingering individuals who observed quietly before turning away, their earlier uncertainty replaced by retrospective understanding of what they had witnessed. The woman finally adjusted her position, taking a calm step forward that aligned her fully with the courthouse entrance, not as a subject of enforcement but as an acknowledged authority within the system that had just verified her identity. There was no announcement, no dramatic gesture, only the completion of institutional recognition that redefined the entire scene in retrospect. Officer Mitchell gave a final glance toward the courthouse steps, then turned slightly away, signaling the end of his involvement in the incident, while Officer Cole and Officer Brooks followed standard procedure to clear the perimeter. The environment itself felt lighter, not because anything had physically changed, but because the uncertainty that had previously defined every interaction had been fully resolved through verified confirmation. The woman paused for a brief moment at the base of the courthouse steps, her presence steady and composed, reflecting neither triumph nor confrontation, but a quiet finality that matched the completion of procedural truth. Behind her, the sidewalk returned to normal movement as pedestrians resumed their routines, no longer observing the space as an active incident but as a resolved event. The officers fully disengaged, returning to standard duty flow, their earlier assumptions now formally corrected within the system records. The courthouse stood unchanged, yet its meaning in the minds of those who had witnessed the event had shifted permanently, now associated with verified authority rather than misinterpreted control. And as the last remaining attention faded from the scene, the moment concluded with a final sense of institutional closure, where identity, jurisdiction, and truth had aligned to replace uncertainty with formal recognition.